Welcome back to Good Revenue. We're here today with Michele Macguire. She is an executive with experience in tech, advertising, media, and entertainment. And today we're going to talk about esports and M&A. So we're very excited to have you, Michele. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
We're really excited to learn a little more about esports. It's a segment that I don't know much about. So maybe you could give us a little bit of context about what's the definition of esports and how did you get into this sector?
I'm really bullish on esports. I think I've been involved in the game industry for some time. First, the answer to your question is that esports is competitive video game tournaments that people watch. So think about it like the TV of video games. Most people would be surprised to find out that it has a very large following. I was originally introduced to the game industry when my media job took me to managing a very large conference for video game developers. We worked to create the largest conference in the world for game developers. And we also moved that business into a lot of international markets as video games went from what was just a North American pursuit to building a whole new market in China, evolving in South America. I had the opportunity to have a front row seat to that. Today, what I do is I work for a video game company that has an esports broadcasting tool. We take advantage of a data analytics backend that we built, and we report on viewership for people who produce those esports events that I referred to earlier.
My sense from looking at some of the analysis from Deloitte and just what's in the news is that the esports business has evolved dramatically, but that it's also been around since the 70s, which was surprising to me. Is that right?
Yeah, there were some very early competitive gaming long before the current platforms. Most esports is played on a platform called Twitch, which is owned by Amazon, and YouTube Live, which is part of the YouTube universe. The very first video games that were played competitively aren't even around anymore. But there's many games that you would recognize if you're familiar with video games at all. League of Legends is the largest esports franchise. Call of Duty, which a lot of people know, is actively played. So many video games that are played individually also have a competitive capability that's utilized in esports.
Okay, that's helpful context, certainly for me. So I know that one of the things that you have done and had a lot of success with is building strong partnerships at crucial stages of the business. And I think that's a hugely important skill set and outcome in any firm. Would you walk us through a couple of the case studies around how you did that? What was the challenge? And what were some of the results of those partnerships?
Sure. So our product was actually, we're a classic startup that started doing something different and then pivoted.
It's almost weird if you had a linear journey, right? So
and this one was really a left turn, but an exciting one. We had built a data analytics platform for different use, and we discovered that we could, in the data language that esports required, which is called concurrent views. So we created this product that rebroadcasts an esports event to a much larger audience. And you referred to the Deloitte statistics earlier. Esports is a really large market, but it's really accelerated in the last 3 to 5 years. And the market is still immature. It's not a really developed, mature ecosystem. So identifying who your customers and partners are is really challenging. In addition to that, the market went through a decline in 2023. So in 2022, we pivoted the entire company to esports. The market went through something referred to as the winter of esports. This immature market that had been overfunded and had lots of exuberance and was oversupplied. It crashed in some ways, Sponsors got wary and the funding wasn't being used as you would hope it would, but viewership never abated. And that, for me, is the magic of this market because, as I mentioned, it's the television of video games. Television is monetized by the number of viewers you can attract. So, in order to build customers and partnership, we had to look across this really young market. And this was a new challenge for me. When you're in a very developed enterprise software market, for instance, the customers are pretty readily identifiable. But this market was going through an enormous amount of change. I think the way that we succeeded in this company was to pick out categories where the activities were growing and then find the companies within those categories that needed us. It was that plain and simple. Our job for anyone who produces an esports event is to provide them with a tool that cost effectively brings them more viewers. Not everybody needs that. I mentioned the top game in esports, League of Legends, which is owned by a company called Riot. They have a massive audience and lots of traction, so they don't need us. But one of our most significant partners is new to esports, and that's the NBA. They partner with a game company and have a game called NBA 2K. Like many pro sports organizations, they recently realized that the younger generation wasn't watching NBA events at the level that their older audience was. So they looked at esports and very quickly rolled out super comprehensive program. They are a great customer for us because they're looking for lots of different ways to build audience. That's where we looked for the partners. We looked for companies or agencies or teams. It's very broad in esports, but we look specifically for those companies that are looking to build more viewers, bring them into the top of their viewership funnel, as we call it in ads, and help them monetize that.
There's so much in that. I am curious to know when you mentioned the NBA, that's obviously an organization with a huge amount of historic viewership on traditional television. Do you see the opportunity in esports as fostering more of that migration? So you're moving those eyeballs from the traditional box or YouTube or wherever people are watching these events now? Or is it that you're looking at sponsors or brand partners who've never even been in media before?
The viewership's already moved. And that's what a lot of organizations are waking up to.
Okay. So they're chasing the audience a little bit.
Pro sports is a great example. Not all pro sports entities have recognized or are dealing with what's happened. I think there's plenty of statistics I can say to you for almost all pro sports teams and organizations. They are recognizing that the current digital native generation, 14 to 30, their attention has moved to different platforms, devices, and screens, whether they're watching a live event on television and at the same time playing a game, or whether they've just moved away from watching events. So whether it's racing, boxing, hockey, basketball, football, soccer, the statistics are there, and the organizations are addressing it in different levels of urgency and activity.
Super interesting. And maybe following up on that a little bit, we had wanted to talk about some of the business models that you're exploring. And that same Deloitte study, which we'll link to in the show notes, mentioned that the revenue potential was around 1.4 billion in 2022. You mentioned there was a bit of a slowdown last year. My understanding is that the revenue streams look like advertising, co-streaming rights, and sponsorships. That same study noted that it's only something like $5 per serious fan. I can see the potential and sense your excitement. How do you actually convert that? Is there anything else you're thinking about, maybe from a brand perspective? What do you think are the opportunities for brands as they look at esports? It seems like they should be thinking about it a little differently again, maybe more so than traditional media. Any thoughts?
Yeah, they have to. And there are more organizations popping up to help them do that. The agency model for esports tends to be more multidisciplinary than I've ever seen in the agency world. They have to understand media concepts. They also have to understand the world of streamers. And you mentioned co-streaming. The world of streamers are so diverse and the numbers are massive, but the engaging relationships with streamers can go from someone really big who's built a professional team around them. On the other end of the spectrum, there's people who are streaming from home and making a really good living. Most streamers, or let's say a significant number of streamers, are gamers. They're in the age demographic they game, and it's comfortable to play video games on a live stream. So you see them doing that a lot, capturing them to help sponsors reach significant audiences is all kinds of models are popping up. Whether it's, I actually just met with someone that I know in the industry yesterday at a conference, and they have a model that accesses streamer audiences en masse based on the platform they've developed. And they're running a program for Miracle Grow, the fertilizer folks, that's a virtual contest. The rewards are virtual fertilizer that grows your garden online. You can play multiple games to participate and win. 100% is that younger people don't know they need fertilizer for their gardens. It's an old style thing. They've spent quite a bit of money on this program, which just rolled out 2 weeks ago. You have to be nimble. You have to bring a lot of capabilities together, including some in real life. That's coming back in esports, and be able to measure it. The biggest fallout in esports was a lot of immature ecosystem that didn't provide data to sponsors to show them that their money was well spent. That was the biggest complaint as sponsors abandoned the market in 2023. But they're coming back. It's the easiest way to access this demographic. 80% of the North American audience from ages 14 to 30 play video games. I don't think most people realize how high it is. And of course, that's a complete range of games from the most casual to the most intense. But very few consumer product organizations don't realize they have to find a way into this audience, and you have to access them differently.
Yeah, I can hear that the potential is there. And the other thing I'm thinking about as you're talking is it sounds like opportunities for product placement would also be significant in this space, which again is everything old is new again, right? Traditional TV, basically.
The early days product placement in video games required an enormous amount of programming, and you couldn't change it. There have been attempts to place things in the game. It's still difficult. It's still expensive. Live streaming allows you to do product placement in the broadcast. So there's lots of cars sitting on stages behind the casters, which are what commentators are called in esports. Lots of branding in front of the announcement desk, and a certain amount of virtual branding in the actual esports game, because it's not in the game, it's on the broadcast platform. So it's much easier to implement. For instance, if it's a Rocket League game, which is a soccer game where cars play soccer, the stadium can be branded just like you would in traditional sports.
So switching gears a bit, I thought we could also talk about M&A. I know you have a lot of experience in that area. What were some of the takeaways, particularly when it comes to integration?
Oh, my favorite part. During my time in technology media and running conferences, I worked for 3 companies that were purchased by the same company. I worked for a large British media company for many years. The company grew through acquisition, primarily through acquisition. So I became involved in acquisitions in some of the brands and products I was running, and moved into a role where my job was to identify targeted companies that would fit in our product portfolios, bring them to the table, develop, bring together a multidisciplinary team to make a deal, and then integrate them in the company. So at any given time, I had companies in various stages of that process. Part of my job was to write the integration plan and fulfill it. So I worked with the management teams to, first of all, to make sure that the integration plan was something they could embrace and believed in, particularly if you were doing a deal where the seller had what we used to call, and I think it still is called, an earnout by many companies. There's a package that includes what you get paid up front and what you get paid over time. And that's always tied to revenue or earnings, the various formulas. You had to write an integration plan where the seller believed in it, felt comfortable with it, and that it was achievable. Secondly, that the team the seller was leaving behind would feel good about participating and fulfilling that integration plan. I think pretty much across the board, whether you're doing super large integrations or small ones, the single most common point of failure in an acquisition is on fulfilling the integration plan. I really like the integration side because it's mostly about the people. You have to know the business, you have to measure the business, but it's mostly about being able to manage a team to success and have them feel good about it. Especially the deals that I have done a lot of, they're smaller, anywhere from $1 million to 50 million. When the company is sold, there's this inevitable sadness if there's a team that have been loyal to the company and really believe in it. And most of the smaller independently owned companies that I worked on acquiring were like that. So you go through a sad part, donuts and coffee on site, and talk about it, and then you roll up your sleeves and figure out who embraces the change and how to fulfill the growth of the company that was planned.
Yeah, that makes
I find
sense. More emotional, certainly, in a smaller
Yeah,
company.
it's people oriented, and I really like
Sure.
that.
One of the things that's so interesting in that is it sounds like the integration plan and the strategy were really part of the deal thesis early on. I'm assuming that's a big part of why those integrations were successful. Is that fair to say? What do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that even the very largest deals that you read about in the newspaper, the biggest one in our industry right now is in the game industry is Microsoft's
Mhm.
acquisition of Activision Blizzard. And there's lots of integration that's written about. And then in the industry, when you talk to people who've consulted on it or know the Activision executives, there's even more that you find out. For instance, the financial efficiencies that will come with all of the back end that Microsoft offers. Activision's a really old game company, and a lot of their stuff has been custom made. One of the talks in the industry is about how efficient that's going to be.
Mm.
The other side of it is that, for instance, in that deal, I just came from a game conference yesterday, and there's a lot of sadness in the industry because a lot of people were laid off that the industry didn't expect to be laid off. Some really iconic, talented people in the game industry. So there's big disappointment in the industry. Now, that's a deal that affects the entire industry, but definitely integration and plans and fulfilling them are carefully written and included in the deal. Some companies, and I imagine that's why it's such a point of failure, some companies don't really emphasize filling that integration plan. So it gets left on the shelf.
You mentioned earnouts earlier. Was part of the strategy to keep the management teams intact, or is it farther down the line, like into sales and marketing or product and engineering. How have you thought about that in the past?
It's keeping, particularly if you have a seller who's really important to the success of the company, you need time to do a transition. It gives you a buffer in case the revenue growth that's represented is unrealistic. So a seller has to live up to what they've projected. It's also stabilizing the team after the seller leaves. So it's financial and operational.
What about when it comes to pricing and the business model, or maybe you're changing the business model as a result of the acquisition? How have you thought about that?
I think that's one of the fun aspects of it as well. Yeah, as a business development person, I really find that fascinating. You look within your company, if you're with a larger company, to figure out what you can bring to the table from internal cost structures, if an independent company can benefit from your broader contracts. I did a lot of event acquisition in my career, and one of the ways you could streamline event costs is, as an event company, you tend to have big contracts across the country, sometimes extending into other countries with an event operations company. So you can slip an event into that and reduce the cost. Also, whether you can cross sell or upsell with an event that's in a similar industry. That goes into the internal projections. In terms of what you're offering the seller, the pricing is a combination of what the seller's projecting and what other information you can gather from the marketplace to support that. You have to go back to the table and say that the market's not supporting it. If I was still doing this and purchasing an esports event in 2022, I would have been very bullish. And then 2023 would have made it so that I wish that we hadn't closed that deal.
The
But
valuations and the multiples have
that
really
happened.
changed, haven't they, in the last
Yeah.
couple of years? Yeah, across
Well,
all
we did.
industries.
Esports particularly went through a
Mm.
very exuberant investment period. Lots of investors came in and purchased teams and invested in team and invested in tournament platforms and all the other things that are involved in esports. 2023 had a lot of fallout, consolidation. Most people in the market would say that we've come out of that and it's a rebuilding phase. But again, for esports, the magic thing was viewership didn't stop going up. So that for all of us bodes well.
Based on this, what's your top advice for CEOs or senior executives in early stage companies?
It's interesting. I've just come, as I mentioned, from this games conference, GamesBeat, which is a wonderful event in our industry. I attended a panel of really successful people in the industry, all have been CEOs. The question posed to them was, what's the shift that you go through, emotional and structural, after you've been out pitching VCs and painting this very rosy aspiration picture to raise money, and then the money comes in, and to a person, they all said it's a really different mindset. You shift into, how do I make this real? And you just go from this very sort of airy, inflated place to, I have to roll my sleeves up and make this work. I think early stage companies, no matter what your investment, and for me, the investors invested in a different model. That model didn't work. The investment had been spent, and we pivoted the company to a new product, and I had to make this company work on the revenue it produced. So that experience has been great. I feel like if I can do this, the amount of grit and hard work it takes and the calculations you do week on week and every month, and if someone has decided they've got a big receivable with you and they're not paying it, I raise my hand and make the phone call, because that's what's going to keep my doors open. That's been a great business experience. I feel like it's been so additive to my business career.
There's so many great insights in that. And one of the ones that really resonates with me is, as you were alluding to, there's such a difference between the pitch to an investor and the success closing those deals, and then what it actually takes to build and offer a product or a service to a customer base. I find that a lot of companies conflate those two, sometimes not intentionally, but those are completely different audiences. And I think you're alluding to that it's something a lot of companies maybe don't pause and really think about.
It was really insightful to see these four people on this panel, all of whom have been very successful, and I really admire. That was the big message. You really have to change your mindset after you've been out there doing those pitches.
Super valuable. This has been such a great conversation, Michele. Just one last question for you. You've had a really diverse and interesting career. What do you think high performance companies do differently from average performers?
They know their customer. It's
Good
the thing
one.
that's so often left out of business. Go out and talk to your customers. The good companies, the high performing companies, tell you why their customers need their product, what they're willing to pay for, and when they will do that. And it's knowing your customer, talking to them.
I love that. That's a great place to leave this conversation. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Thanks so much for listening to Good Revenue. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe to the show, give us a rating, or leave us a review. It helps other listeners find us, and we really appreciate your support. You can also catch full videos and highlights on our YouTube channel.